The letter arrived on a particularly harsh Tuesday in March 1879, when the wind howled across the Montana Territory like a wounded animal. Beatrice Lowry stood on the train platform clutching that same letter, her gray traveling dress whipping around her ankles as she scanned the nearly empty station for the man who had promised to meet her. The letter had traveled thousands of miles just as she had from her home in Boston to this desolate frontier town called Whispering Pines. "Miss, you look a mite lost." An elderly station attendant approached, his weathered face creased with concern. "I'm waiting for Mr. Kyle Kincaid," Beatrice replied, her voice measured and even despite her racing heart. "He was to meet me upon arrival." The attendant's expression shifted, and Beatrice recognized it immediately, the same look of pity she'd received her entire life. "Ah, you must be the mail-order bride. Kyle's likely still at his ranch. Spring calving season has everyone stretched thin." Beatrice straightened her spine. "I see. Could you direct me to his property?" "7 miles west, miss, but you can't possibly. I assure you I am quite capable." Beatrice cut him off, reaching for her trunk. "Is there perhaps a wagon for hire?" The attendant studied her, this slender woman with her immaculate gloves and upswept hair, eyes serious as a judge's and not a trace of a smile on her face. "Tucker over at the livery might help, just. Folks around here are different from what you're probably used to, miss." Beatrice had heard similar warnings her entire life. Too serious, too practical. Too focused, these were the criticisms that had followed her from finishing school to the society parties where she'd stood silently in corners while other young women charmed and flirted. At 26, with her parents gone and her inheritance dwindling, the advertisement seeking a woman of good moral character and strong constitution for marriage in the Montana Territory had seemed like divine providence. The livery owner, Tucker, was no more encouraging than the station attendant. "Kyle Kincaid's place, that's a fair piece out, madam, and not what you'd call welcoming," he chuckled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Reckon you're the Eastern lady he sent for, thought he'd get someone a bit more." Cheerful like, Beatrice refused to wilt under his assessment. "I require transportation, Mr. Tucker, not commentary on my disposition." Her clipped tone only amused him further. "Yes, madam, sure enough, I can take you out there tomorrow morning. Today, if you please." "I've traveled quite far enough to be kept waiting any longer." Tucker glanced at the darkening sky. "Storms brewing wouldn't be wise. Neither was traveling 3,000 miles to marry a stranger, yet here I stand." Beatrice met his gaze steadily. "I shall pay extra for the inconvenience." An hour later, Beatrice found herself jolting along a rutted trail in Tucker's wagon, her trunk secured behind them as they pushed westward through an increasingly barren landscape. The wind cut through her woolen coat, and she pressed her gloved hands together for warmth. "You ain't much for talking, are you?" Tucker observed after several miles of silence. "I find excessive conversation tiresome when there is nothing of substance to discuss," Beatrice replied. Tucker barked out a laugh. "Lord have mercy, Kyle's got himself a real prize winner." "That man needs a woman who can laugh, not another reason to brood." Beatrice swallowed back a retort. The mail between her and Kyle had been brief and practical. He needed a wife to help manage his household and potentially bear children. She needed security and a fresh start. Neither had made false pretenses about romance. The rain began as they crested a hill, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled in a valley below. A modest 2-story house stood flanked by a barn, corrals, and several outbuildings. Even from a distance, Beatrice could see it needed a woman's touch. The curtainless windows stared back like empty eyes. "That's Kincaid's place," Tucker announced unnecessarily. "Finest cattle operation in the county, even if the man himself is about as friendly as a rattlesnake." They approached a gate where a hand-carved sign reads Starlight Ranch. As Tucker guided the wagon down the sloping drive, 3 men emerged from the barn. One strode purposefully toward them, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Beatrice felt her breath catch. This must be Kyle Kincaid. He reached the wagon just as Tucker pulled the horses to a stop. Up close, Kyle was more intimidating than Beatrice had anticipated, at least 6 feet tall with a dark beard framing a sun-weathered face. His eyes, a startling blue, assessed her critically. "Mr. Kincaid," Beatrice said, inclining her head, "I am Beatrice Lowry." For a long moment, Kyle said nothing, simply staring at her as rain began to soak through his shirt. Finally, he reached for her trunk. "You're early, wasn't expecting you till next week." Beatrice blinked, fighting to maintain her composure. "I wrote to inform you of my change in plans. The letter should have arrived last Tuesday," Kyle grunted. "Haven't been to town in 3 weeks." He handed Tucker a few coins. "Much obliged for bringing her out." Tucker tipped his hat to Beatrice. "Good luck to you, madam. You're gonna need it with this one." As Tucker's wagon disappeared back up the road, Beatrice stood in the muddy yard, raindrops sliding down her face as Kyle carried her trunk toward the house. She lifted her skirts and followed, determined not to show any sign of the doubt now creeping through her veins. The interior of the house was exactly as she had feared, sparsely furnished, with months' worth of dust coating every surface. A pot of something unidentifiable bubbled on the stove, filling the kitchen with an acrid smell. "You'll sleep upstairs," Kyle said, setting down her trunk. "Bathroom's out back, got no time for pleasantries today, calving season. We can discuss arrangements at supper." Beatrice removed her soaked gloves. "Mr. Kincaid, I believe we should clarify certain expectations before expectation is I'll be back by dark and you'll have food ready," he interrupted. "Everything else can wait." With that, he turned and strode back into the rain, leaving Beatrice alone in the silent house. She stood motionless for several minutes, then methodically removed her wet coat and hat. There would be time for disappointment later. Now there was work to be done. By the time Kyle returned that evening, Beatrice had transformed the kitchen. The floors were swept, surfaces scrubbed, and a proper meal of salt pork and beans simmered on the stove. She had changed into a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned back as she set the table. Kyle paused in the doorway, clearly taken aback by the change. His eyes darted around the room before settling on Beatrice. "You've been busy?" "I believe in efficiency, Mr. Kincaid," she gestured to the table. "Please sit, the food is ready." They ate in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds their cutlery against the plates and the occasional crackle from the stove. Beatrice waited until Kyle had finished before speaking. "I think we should discuss the terms of our arrangement," she said calmly. "I understand this is a marriage of convenience, but I would appreciate clarity regarding your expectations." Kyle wiped his mouth with a napkin one Beatrice had found in a drawer and properly washed. "Expectations are simple. You keep house, cook meals, mend clothes. I provide shelter, food, protection. No need to complicate things. And our marital relations," a flush crept up Kyle's neck. "We'll marry properly when the circuit preacher comes through next month. Until then, you take the bedroom upstairs. I'll bunk in the spare room." "I see." Beatrice folded her hands in her lap. "And children, your advertisement mentioned the desire for a family." "Eventually," Kyle stood abruptly. "Look, Miss Lowry, you're not what I expected." "No," Beatrice's tone remained even though her heart sank. "How so? He gestured vaguely. "Stiff, serious, like you swallowed a book of rules." The words stung, familiar as they were. "I assure you, Mr. Kincaid, I am perfectly capable of fulfilling the duties outlined in our correspondence. It ain't about capability." Kyle ran a hand through his hair. "A ranch wife needs grit, sure, but also some warmth. Life out here's hard enough without coming home to more coldness." Beatrice felt her cheeks burn. "I see. Perhaps you should have specified you wanted a performing monkey rather than a competent partner." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her sharp retort. "That's not, Mr. Kincaid," Beatrice interrupted, rising to her feet. "I have traveled a considerable distance based on our agreement. If you find me unsuitable, I would appreciate honesty rather than insults." They stared at each other across the table, the air between them charged with tension. Finally, Kyle sighed. "I'm not sending you back," he said gruffly. "We made an agreement, just give it time. Maybe we'll both adjust." Beatrice nodded stiffly. "Very well. Good night, Mr. Kincaid." As she climbed the stairs to her new bedroom, Beatrice allowed herself a moment of doubt. Perhaps she had made a terrible mistake. But when she looked out the window at the vast, wild landscape stretching to the horizon, she straightened her shoulders. She had survived worse than a disappointed bridegroom. This was her new life, and she would face it with the same determination that had carried her this far. The next morning, Beatrice rose before dawn. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, pinned her hair severely back, and descended to the kitchen. By the time Kyle appeared, she had breakfast waiting: eggs, bacon, and fresh bread she had started the night before. Kyle paused in the doorway, clearly surprised. "You're up early." "I believe in beginning as one means to go on," Beatrice replied, pouring coffee into a mug for him. "I've taken the liberty of planning a schedule for household tasks." Kyle accepted the coffee with a grunt that might have been thanks. As he ate, Beatrice outlined her intentions for the day: laundry, a thorough cleaning of the upstairs, an inventory of pantry supplies. "Town's 15 miles, Kyle said between bites. "Supply wagon comes through once a month, but if you need anything urgent, write it down. I'll head in next week." "Thank you." Beatrice hesitated, then asked, "Is there a garden plot? I notice your vegetable stores are low." Kyle looked up, seeming to actually see her for the first time that morning. "South side of the house. Been fallow 2 years since my mother passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Beatrice said automatically. "Been just me and Pa since then, till he took a fall last winter. Doctor in town says he won't walk again, so he's staying with my sister in Bozeman." Kyle's expression darkened. "That's why I needed someone. Too much for one man alone." Understanding dawned on Beatrice. "You're caring for your injured father as well as running this ranch. Sister's got him now." Kyle stood, taking his hat from a hook by the door. "Got cattle to move today, won't be back till supper." After he left, Beatrice stood in the quiet kitchen, reassessing her situation. Kyle Kincaid wasn't simply a bachelor seeking a wife, he was a son who had watched his family dissolve, leaving him alone with a ranch too big for one person to manage. Perhaps his gruff exterior masked something deeper. The day passed in a blur of work. Beatrice discovered muscles she never knew existed as she hauled water, scrubbed floors, and beat rugs. The neglect of the house was even worse than she'd initially thought. Every drawer held broken items, every cupboard contained expired foodstuffs. By mid-afternoon, her hands were raw and her back ached, but a sense of accomplishment drove her forward. As promised, Kyle returned at dusk, tracking mud and the scent of cattle into the freshly cleaned house. Beatrice bit back a reprimand and instead pointed to a basin of warm water she'd prepared. "If you wouldn't mind washing before supper," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Kyle looked ready to object, then glanced down at his filthy boots and clothes. Without a word, he removed his boots at the door and washed his hands and face before approaching the table. Supper was a simple affair of stew and cornbread, but Kyle ate with obvious appreciation. "This is good," he said after his second helping. "Been living on salt pork and beans for months." "Thank you." Beatrice allowed herself a small smile. "I found your mother's recipe book." "I hope you don't mind." Something softened in Kyle's expression. "No, she'd be pleased to see her kitchen being used proper again." They fell into silence, but it felt less strained than the previous night. As Beatrice cleared the dishes, Kyle remained at the table, watching her with an unreadable expression. "The men have been talking," he finally said. Beatrice paused. "Oh, word travels fast out here. They're curious about you." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "There's a gathering at the Hendersons' place Saturday. Thought you might want to meet some of the neighbor women." Beatrice carefully kept her expression neutral, though inside she felt a flutter of anxiety. Social gatherings had never been her forte. "That would be informative, thank you." Kyle nodded, standing to leave, then hesitated. "Miss Lowry, Beatrice, I know this isn't what either of us expected, but I appreciate the work you've done here today." It wasn't an apology for his remarks the previous night, but it was something. Beatrice inclined her head. "Good night, Mr. Kincaid." "Kyle," he corrected. "If we're to be married, might as well use our given names." "Good night, Kyle," Beatrice amended, and was rewarded with the briefest flicker of a smile before he departed for his room. The days fell into a rhythm. Beatrice rose before dawn to prepare breakfast and pack a midday meal for Kyle. She spent her days transforming the neglected house, unearthing treasures amid the clutter, a beautiful quilt, delicate china, family photographs in tarnished frames. In the evenings, she served supper and listened as Kyle gradually began to share more about the ranch, the cattle, the challenges of the season. He never spoke of personal matters, and Beatrice never asked. Their relationship remained coolly polite, like business partners rather than a couple approaching marriage. Still, Beatrice found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way his hands, calloused and strong, cradled his coffee mug. The rare occasions when his serious face broke into a smile at some memory or thought. Saturday arrived all too quickly. Beatrice spent the morning in a state of quiet anxiety, pressing her best dress and arranging her hair in a style that was neat but not ostentatious. When Kyle knocked on her door to announce it was time to leave, she squared her shoulders as if preparing for battle. The Hendersons' ranch was larger than Kyle's, with a sprawling main house surrounded by cottonwood trees. As their wagon approached, Beatrice could hear music and laughter spilling from the open doors and windows. At least 24 horses and wagons were already tied at the hitching posts. "The Hendersons hold these gatherings every month or so," Kyle explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "Good for morale, especially after the long winter." Beatrice nodded, gripping her reticule tightly as they walked toward the house. Kyle must have noticed her tension, for he paused before they reached the porch. "These are good people," he said quietly. "Rough around the edges, maybe, but decent. They'll be curious about you, but they don't mean any harm." "I am quite accustomed to scrutiny, Kyle," Beatrice replied, lifting her chin. "Shall we?" The noise inside was overwhelming after the quiet of the ranch house. People packed the main room, where furniture had been pushed aside to create a dance floor. A trio of musicians played fiddle, banjo, and harmonica while couples twirled in dizzying circles. Kyle Kincaid, "As I Live and Breathe." A robust woman with graying hair pushed through the crowd toward them. "And this must be your Eastern lady, Mrs. Henderson," Kyle nodded respectfully. "This is Beatrice Lowry. Beatrice, Martha Henderson, our hostess." Martha's shrewd eyes assessed Beatrice from head to toe. "Well, aren't you a proper one? Come along, dear. Let me introduce you to the other ladies while the men folk talk cattle prices." Before Beatrice could protest, Martha had linked arms with her and was steering her toward a group of women near the refreshment table. Kyle gave her an apologetic glance before being pulled in the opposite direction by a boisterous rancher. The women fell silent as Martha presented Beatrice. 5 pairs of eyes studied her with undisguised curiosity. "Ladies, this is Beatrice Lowry, Kyle Kincaid's fiancée from back east. Beatrice, these are your neighbors Sarah Donnelly, Rebecca Wilson, the Fleming sisters Judith and Ruth, and my daughter Abigail." Beatrice managed a polite smile. "How do you do? So formal," giggled the younger Fleming sister. "Are all Boston ladies so starchy, Ruth?" Her sister admonished, though her own eyes danced with amusement. "We're just surprised Kyle finally sent for a bride," said Rebecca Wilson, a slender woman with kind eyes. "After Alina Jenkins returned to St. Louis last year, we thought he'd given up." Beatrice's smile froze. "Alina Jenkins," the women exchanged glances. Martha Henderson sighed. "Perhaps Kyle hasn't mentioned. Well, Alina was also a mail-order bride. Lasted 6 weeks before declaring Montana uncivilized and demanding passage home." "I see." Beatrice fought to keep her expression neutral. "Mr. Kincaid did not mention a previous arrangement." "Men never do," chuckled Sarah Donnelly, "but you seem made of sterner stuff than Alina." She nearly fainted at the sight of Kyle butchering a chicken. The women laughed, and Beatrice forced herself to join in, though her mind was whirling. Kyle had attempted this before and failed. No wonder he had seemed so disappointed in her. He was comparing her to someone else entirely. The evening progressed painfully slowly. Beatrice endured countless introductions, each newcomer openly appraising her like livestock at auction. She heard the whispers, serious as a funeral, "Cold fish." Poor Kyle, but kept her head high and her expression composed. When the dancing began in earnest, Beatrice retreated to a corner, watching as couples swirled across the floor. Kyle appeared occasionally in her line of sight, speaking with various ranchers, his usual solemn expression softening as he conversed with people he clearly considered friends. "Not one for dancing," a deep voice startled her from her thoughts. A tall man with sandy hair and an impressive mustache smiled down at her. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the steps," Beatrice replied politely. "Logan Pierce," the man introduced himself with a slight bow. "I run the mercantile in town, and you're Kyle's Eastern bride, causing quite the stir," Beatrice bristled. "I wasn't aware my presence was so disruptive," Logan laughed. "Only because Kyle Kincaid's personal business is the best entertainment for 50 miles, especially after the last time." He leaned closer. "Between us, Alina was all wrong for him, pretty and vivacious, but useless as a milking stool in a stampede." Before Beatrice could respond, she sensed someone approaching. Kyle appeared at her side, his expression thunderous as he looked at Logan. "Pierce," he said coldly. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," Logan replied, unperturbed by Kyle's obvious hostility. "Just getting acquainted with your lovely fiancée. She's quite different from Alina, isn't she?" Kyle's jaw tightened. "Beatrice, they're serving supper in the dining room, shall we?" Without waiting for an answer, he placed a hand at the small of her back, guiding her away from Logan, whose amused chuckle followed them across the room. "You didn't tell me about Alina Jenkins," Beatrice said quietly as they found seats at the long dining table. Kyle's expression darkened further. "Wasn't relevant. I disagree. It seems quite relevant that I'm not your first attempt at acquiring a wife." "It was a mistake," Kyle muttered. "She wasn't suited for ranch life." "And you believe I am?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. Kyle looked at her then, really looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "You're stronger than she was. Maybe too serious, but strong. That matters more out here than a pretty smile." The compliment, if it could be called that, warmed Beatrice unexpectedly. Before she could respond, Martha Henderson called for everyone's attention, announcing that the circuit preacher would lead them in grace before the meal. The white-haired preacher stood, beaming at the gathered crowd. "Before we bless this food, I understand we have a new arrival in our community. Kyle Kincaid's mail-order bride has finally arrived, and I hear they're waiting on my next visit to tie the knot. Where are you, my dear?" All eyes turned to Beatrice, who felt heat rising in her cheeks as the preacher continued. "Now, I'm due back this way in 2 weeks' time." "Shall we plan for a wedding then, Kyle?" Kyle glanced at Beatrice, a question in his eyes. She gave a slight nod. 2 weeks is fine, Preacher Williams," Kyle confirmed. A chorus of cheers and good-natured teasing erupted around the table. Beatrice sat rigid as several women immediately began discussing wedding preparations. Her stomach knotted as she realized that in just 14 days, she would be irrevocably bound to this man she barely knew. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. After supper, the dancing resumed with greater enthusiasm, fueled by good food and the excitement of an upcoming wedding. To Beatrice's surprise, Kyle approached her as the musicians struck up a slower tune. "Might as well give them something to talk about," he said, extending his hand. "May I have this dance?" Beatrice hesitated. "I warned you, I'm not familiar with, just follow my lead," Kyle said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "It's not so different from Boston dancing, I'd wager." Reluctantly, Beatrice placed her hand in his. Kyle led her to the edge of the dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while holding her other hand. The contact, even through layers of clothing, sent an unexpected shiver through Beatrice. "Just step with the music," Kyle murmured, beginning to move. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Beatrice focused intently on her feet, determined not to embarrass herself. Kyle was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, guiding her smoothly through the steps. Gradually, she relaxed enough to look up from their feet. "You dance well for a rancher," she observed. A hint of a smile touched Kyle's lips. "My mother insisted her sons learn, said no Kincaid would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo." The image made Beatrice smile despite herself. "She sounds like a formidable woman." She was. Something softened in Kyle's expression. "You remind me of her sometimes. She never wasted words either." Before Beatrice could decide if this was a compliment, the music ended. Kyle released her and stepped back, the brief moment of connection between them already fading. "We should head back soon," he said, his usual gruff tone returning. "Early start tomorrow." The ride home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon creaked along the moonlit trail. Beatrice replayed the evening in her mind, the whispers, the scrutiny, the revelation about Alina. When they reached the ranch, Kyle helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her arm a moment longer than necessary. "I should have told you about Alina," he said suddenly. "It wasn't fair to keep that from you." Beatrice studied his face in the silver moonlight. "No, it wasn't." "But I appreciate the acknowledgement." Kyle nodded, seemingly relieved by her measured response. "For what it's worth, you handled tonight better than she ever could have. Those people respect strength, even if they don't quite understand your way of showing it." It was perhaps the kindest thing he had said to her since her arrival. "Thank you, Kyle. Good night." As Beatrice prepared for bed that night, she found herself considering Kyle Kincaid with new eyes. Beneath his gruff exterior was a man who had lost his mother, sent his injured father away, and been abandoned by his first attempt at a mail-order bride. No wonder he kept people at arm's length. She recognized the strategy well. It was one she had employed herself after losing her parents. The next morning, Kyle left before dawn for a neighboring ranch where a bull had broken through a fence. Beatrice found herself alone for the first time since her arrival, the house quiet around her. After completing her morning chores, she decided to explore the garden plot Kyle had mentioned. The space behind the house was overgrown but showed signs of once careful planning. Remnants of planting beds were visible beneath the weeds, and a broken trellis leaned against the back wall of the house. Beatrice knelt, digging her fingers into the soil. It was rich and dark, good-growing earth. "Need any help with that?" Beatrice started, looking up to find a young man watching her from the edge of the garden. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a shock of red hair beneath his hat and freckles scattered across his sunburned face. "I'm Ethan," he said, approaching. "Work for Mr. Kincaid. He said you might be wanting to get this garden going again." Beatrice rose, brushing dirt from her hands. "Yes, I was just assessing the condition. It needs considerable work." Ethan grinned. "Mrs. Kincaid, the old Mrs. Kincaid, I mean she grew everything here. Tomatoes, beans, squash, even melons. Had the sweetest watermelons you ever tasted. Did you work here when she was alive?" "Yes, madam. Started when I was 15, right after my pa died. Old Mrs. Kincaid treated me like family." His expression grew serious. "Been hard on Kyle since she passed." "Then Mr. Kincaid Sr. had his accident." Beatrice studied the young man. "Ethan, may I ask you something directly?" "Yes, madam." "Why did Alina Jenkins leave?" Ethan's freckled face reddened. "Don't rightly know if I should, please," Beatrice interrupted. "I need to understand what I'm facing." Ethan sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair. Miss Alina wasn't cut out for ranch life, complained about everything, the dust, the work, the isolation, but mostly, he hesitated, mostly, she didn't understand Kyle. Called him cold, unfeeling, but that ain't true. Kyle feels things deep, just doesn't show it like other folks. Ethan replaced his hat. The night she left, there was a terrible row. She said he needed a housekeeper, not a wife, and he'd be better off marrying his cattle for all the affection he showed. Beatrice absorbed this information, thinking of Kyle's initial disappointment in her seriousness. "I see. Don't judge him too harsh, madam. Kyle's a good man." "Best I've ever worked for." Ethan gestured to the garden. "If you're set on fixing this up, I can clear the worst of the weeds. Got some seedlings started in the barn too. Mrs. Kincaid always had me start them early." "That would be most helpful, thank you." Beatrice felt a new respect for this young man who had clearly been devoted to Kyle's family. "Were there other workers before me?" "Just me and Hank full-time, few seasonal hands during calving and branding. Kyle let the housekeeper go after his ma died, said he didn't need the expense." Ethan looked around the neglected garden. Been ashamed to see this place go to seed. Felt like, I don't know, like the heart went out of the ranch. Beatrice nodded thoughtfully. "Well, we shall have to see about restoring it, shan't we?" Ethan grinned. "Yes, madam." "You tell me what you need, and I'll help when I can." When Kyle returned that evening, he found Beatrice and Ethan in the garden, the young ranch hand digging up stubborn root systems while Beatrice carefully mapped out planting rows on a piece of paper. They were so engrossed in their work that neither noticed Kyle watching from the back porch, an unreadable expression on his face. Supper that night was less strained than usual. Emboldened by her conversation with Ethan, Beatrice ventured to ask Kyle about his cattle operation. "Ethan mentioned you're known for your Herefords. Is that a common breed in this region?" Kyle looked up, clearly surprised by her interest. "Not as common as it should be. Most ranchers here still run Longhorns, but Herefords put on weight faster and handle the cold better." "How many head do you manage?" "About 600, give or take." Kyle seemed to warm to the subject. "Started with just 50 when my father bought this place 20 years ago. Been building the herd ever since." Beatrice nodded. "A significant achievement." "And you handle the breeding program yourself?" "Yes." A hint of pride crept into Kyle's voice as he described his selective breeding techniques, his careful record keeping, his plans for expanding into new bloodlines. Beatrice listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that clearly pleased him. As she cleared the dishes later, Kyle lingered at the table. "You spoke with Ethan today." It wasn't a question, but Beatrice answered anyway. "Yes, he's been very helpful with the garden planning." "He's a good worker, loyal." Kyle hesitated. "Did he mention anything about the past?" Beatrice considered deflecting but decided on honesty. "He told me a little about Alina Jenkins, about why she left." Kyle's expression closed off. That wasn't his place. "Perhaps not," Beatrice said carefully, "but I'm glad to know. Kyle, I understand why you might be hesitant after that experience." "Do you?" His voice held a challenge. "I believe so." Beatrice set down the plate she was drying and faced him directly. "You need a partner who understands that ranch life isn't easy or glamorous. Someone who won't break at the first hardship." She paused. "I may not be what you pictured, but I am not Alina Jenkins. I don't require constant entertainment or affection to fulfill my duties." Kyle studied her for a long moment. "And is that all you want from marriage, to fulfill duties?" The question caught Beatrice off guard. I want security, purpose." "Not love." The word seemed to stick in his throat. Beatrice looked away. "Love is a luxury, Mr. Kincaid. One I learned long ago not to expect." She felt rather than saw him rise from the table. "Maybe we're more alike than I thought," he said quietly, and then he was gone, the back door closing softly behind him. The following days brought a shift in their relationship. Kyle began including Beatrice in more aspects of ranch life, explaining the spring routines, introducing her to the other hands, even showing her his prized bull, a massive Hereford named Emperor that had cost more than most men's yearly wages. For her part, Beatrice threw herself into transforming the house and garden. Each evening when Kyle returned, some new improvement greeted him: curtains hung, furniture polished, a freshly painted door. She never mentioned their impending wedding, and neither did he, though the date loomed closer with each passing day. On Wednesday, a week before the ceremony was to take place, Kyle announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Is there anything specific you need?" he asked, an unprecedented consideration. Beatrice thought of her dwindling personal items. "Yes, actually, I'll make a list." When she handed him the neatly written inventory, Kyle studied it with a frown. "These are just practical items: soap, thread, writing paper." "Those are what I need," Beatrice replied, puzzled by his reaction. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "Most women would include, I don't know, ribbon or candy or some such." "I see no need for frivolities." Kyle pocketed the list with a sigh. "I'll return by nightfall. Ethan will be around if you need anything." After he departed, Beatrice busied herself with laundry, taking advantage of the clear spring day to wash and hang the heavy quilts that had been stored in the attic. As she worked, she found herself wondering about Kyle's comment. Did he want her to be more frivolous? To ask for pretty things instead of necessities? The thought troubled her as she stretched a quilt across the clothesline. Her practical nature had served her well through life's hardships: her father's business failure, her mother's long illness, their deaths in quick succession. Being serious hadn't been a choice but a survival strategy. If Kyle wanted a light-hearted wife who requested ribbons and sweets, he had indeed chosen poorly. As promised, Kyle returned at dusk, his wagon loaded with supplies. Beatrice helped unload, noting with surprise that he had purchased not only everything on her list, but also several items she hadn't. Requested a bolt of blue calico fabric that matched her eyes, a small jar of lemon drops, and most surprisingly, 3 books of poetry. "I noticed you had none in the house," Kyle said gruffly when she discovered them. "Thought you might like something to read besides my mother's recipe books." The gesture touched Beatrice deeply. "Thank you, that was very thoughtful," Kyle nodded, clearly embarrassed by her gratitude. "There's something else." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box. "Preacher Williams reminded me when I saw him in town, can't have a proper wedding without this." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. It was my mother's. "If you'd prefer something else, no," Beatrice interrupted, oddly moved. "It's perfect." Their eyes met over the ring, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Then Kyle snapped the box closed and returned it to his pocket. "Wedding's a week from today," he said, his voice rough. "Martha Henderson and some of the other women want to help with preparations. Said they'd ride over tomorrow to discuss it with you." Beatrice felt a flutter of anxiety. "I see," Kyle must have noticed her expression. "You don't have to do anything grand. These people aren't expecting fancy Boston doings." "It's not that," Beatrice admitted. "I've never been particularly skilled at female friendships. I tend to alienate other women." To her surprise, Kyle's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Martha Henderson has befriended grizzly bears and mountain lions. I doubt your seriousness will scare her off." The next day, true to Kyle's prediction, Martha arrived with Rebecca Wilson and Judith Fleming in tow, their wagon loaded with baskets and parcels. "We've brought everything we need to plan a proper wedding," Martha announced, bustling into the kitchen. "Oh my, Beatrice, you've worked wonders with this place." The women spread their supplies across the kitchen table: fabric samples, recipe cards, dried flowers preserved from the previous summer. Beatrice watched in bemusement as they discussed cake flavors and decorations with the seriousness of military strategists planning a campaign. "Now for your dress," Martha said, turning to Beatrice. "I understand you've brought some finery from Boston." Beatrice nodded. "I have a blue silk that would be suitable." The women exchanged glances. "Blue for a wedding?" Judith looked scandalized. "It's what I have," Beatrice said simply. Rebecca studied her thoughtfully. "I have my daughter's wedding dress packed away. She's about your size. It's simple but lovely, cream colored with lace at the collar." "That's very kind, but no buts," Martha interrupted. "A bride should wear something special. Besides, it's tradition, something borrowed, something blue. You can wear a blue ribbon in your hair and borrow the dress." Beatrice wanted to refuse, but saw the eagerness in their faces. These women had ridden 15 miles to help a stranger prepare for her wedding. The least she could do was accept their assistance graciously. "Thank you," she said finally. "That's very generous." The women beamed, and Beatrice found herself drawn into their planning despite her reservations. By the time they departed late that afternoon, she had somehow agreed to a proper ceremony with flowers, music, and a wedding supper for 20 guests. When Kyle returned that evening, Beatrice recounted the day's events with a touch of bewilderment. "I'm afraid the wedding has grown beyond what I anticipated." Kyle hung his hat by the door. "Martha Henderson is a force of nature. Did she talk you into using her family Bible too?" "Yes, how did you know?" "She did the same for my sister's wedding." Kyle seemed amused rather than concerned. "Does it bother you? We can still do something simpler." Beatrice considered the question seriously. "No, I suppose not. It's just, I never imagined having a real wedding. It seemed unnecessary for our arrangement." Kyle studied her, his expression unreadable. "What did you imagine, Beatrice?" "When you answered my advertisement," the directness of the question caught her off guard. "I imagined safety, a home of my own, purpose." She met his gaze steadily. "What did you imagine, Kyle?" He looked away. "Someone to bring life back to this place. It's been too quiet since Mother died." "And am I succeeding in that regard?" Beatrice couldn't keep a hint of vulnerability from her voice. Kyle's eyes returned to her face. Yes, he said simply. More than I expected. The week before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Rebecca brought the promised dress, which fit Beatrice as if made for her. Women from neighboring ranches arrived daily with contributions: a tablecloth here, preserved fruits there, offers to play music or help with cooking. Beatrice found herself overwhelmed by the community's generosity. Kyle, meanwhile, seemed to be avoiding the house, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. When he was present, he was quieter than usual, watching Beatrice with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. They circled each other carefully, both aware that they stood on the precipice of a lifelong commitment neither had fully anticipated when they began this arrangement. The night before the wedding, Kyle cleared his throat after supper. "I've been thinking about tomorrow." Beatrice set down her teacup. "Yes, after the ceremony the guests will expect us to share a room." Kyle's neck reddened above his collar. "I want you to know I don't expect anything from you, not until you're ready." The consideration in his words touched Beatrice deeply. "Thank you, Kyle." "That's very gentlemanly," he nodded, clearly relieved to have the conversation behind them. "I've asked Ethan to drive you to the church tomorrow. I'll ride ahead with Hank to make sure everything's ready." "Very well." Beatrice hesitated, then added, "Kyle, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I intend to be a good wife to you. I may not be as expressive as others, but I am committed to making this marriage succeed." Something shifted in Kyle's expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight relaxation of his perpetually tense shoulders. "I know, Beatrice. That's why I think this might work after all." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring morning with just enough breeze to carry the scent of wildflowers through the open windows. Beatrice found herself uncharacteristically nervous as she bathed and dressed, Rebecca's borrowed gown flowing around her like a cloud. Martha Henderson arrived early, bringing her daughter Abigail to help with Beatrice's hair. The young woman worked deftly, weaving a blue ribbon through Beatrice's dark tresses before securing them in an elegant arrangement. "You look beautiful," Martha declared when they finished. "Kyle won't know what hit him." Beatrice studied her reflection in the small mirror. The woman who looked back seemed a stranger, softer somehow, less severe than the Boston spinster who had arrived by train 3 weeks earlier. The small church in Whispering Pines was filled to capacity when Beatrice arrived with Ethan. It seemed the entire community had turned out for the occasion, curious to witness Kyle Kincaid's marriage to his Eastern bride. As Beatrice stepped through the door on Ethan's arm, he had shyly offered to give her away in the absence of her father. A hush fell over the congregation. Kyle stood at the altar beside Preacher Williams, his usual work clothes replaced by a dark suit that transformed him. He had trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, but it was his expression that caught Beatrice's breath, a look of such intensity, such focus, as their eyes met across the crowded room. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Beatrice heard herself repeating vows, felt the cool metal of her mother-in-law's ring sliding onto her finger, saw Kyle's hand steady and sure as he made his promises. When Preacher Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher prompted when Kyle hesitated. Beatrice felt a moment of panic. They had never discussed this part of the ceremony. But Kyle leaned forward with surprising gentleness, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was brief but unmistakably tender. Something fluttered in Beatrice's chest at the contact, a sensation she couldn't name but found herself wanting to explore further. The celebration afterward was unlike anything Beatrice had experienced in Boston society. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in attendance. A fiddle player struck up lively tunes, and soon the churchyard was filled with dancing couples. Kyle kept close to Beatrice's side, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back as he introduced her as "my wife" with what sounded like pride. "You've done well, Kyle," Martha Henderson declared as she embraced them both. "She's already worked miracles with that mausoleum you call a house." "She has," Kyle agreed, and Beatrice felt herself flush at the approval in his voice. As the afternoon waned into evening, guests began to depart, each stopping to offer congratulations and often advice that made both bride and groom blush. Finally, only Kyle and Beatrice remained, standing beside their wagon as the last visitors disappeared down the dusty road. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Kincaid?" Kyle asked, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. The name her new name sent an unexpected thrill through Beatrice. "Yes," she said, placing her hand in his. "I'm ready." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in thought as the reality of their new situation settled around them. When they arrived, Kyle surprised Beatrice by lifting her from the wagon and carrying her across the threshold. "I believe it's traditional," he explained, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor. "Yes," Beatrice agreed, suddenly shy, "though I didn't expect you to observe such customs." Kyle rubbed the back of his neck. "I want to do this properly, Beatrice. You deserve that much." The sincerity in his voice moved her. "Thank you, Kyle." They stood awkwardly in the parlor, neither quite sure how to proceed. Finally, Kyle cleared his throat. "I should check on the cattle before turning in. Why don't you make yourself comfortable? I'll be back shortly." Beatrice nodded, grateful for the reprieve. After Kyle departed, she climbed the stairs to their bedroom now, and changed from her wedding gown into a modest nightdress. She brushed out her hair, removed the blue ribbon, and sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding as she waited for her husband's return. When Kyle entered some time later, he paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of Beatrice with her hair loose around her shoulders. "You look different," he observed. "Is that good or bad?" Beatrice asked, unable to read his expression. "Good," Kyle said quickly. "Very good." He moved to the dresser, removing his jacket and tie. "I'll use the washroom down the hall, give you some privacy." When he returned, dressed in nightclothes with his hair damp from washing, Beatrice had already slipped beneath the covers. Kyle hesitated, then extinguished the lamp and joined her, careful to maintain space between them. "Good night, Beatrice," he said into the darkness. "Good night, Kyle." Neither moved for several minutes, the silence broken only by their breathing. Then, to Beatrice's surprise, Kyle spoke again. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice low. "I may not be good at showing it, but I'm glad you're here, not just for the cooking and cleaning, but for you. The way you are." Beatrice felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "Even though I'm too serious." "You're exactly serious enough," Kyle replied, and she felt his hand find hers beneath the covers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her smooth ones. "Your strength is what I need most. What this place needs." The admission, so simple yet profound, broke something open in Beatrice's chest. She squeezed his hand, unable to find words for the emotion welling within her. They fell asleep that way, hands joined in the darkness, a tentative bridge built between their separate worlds. The weeks following the wedding brought subtle changes to life at Starlight Ranch. Kyle began taking breakfast on the porch with Beatrice before starting his day, lingering over coffee to discuss his plans. In the evenings, they sat together in the parlor, Beatrice mending or reading aloud from one of the poetry books while Kyle whittled or reviewed his cattle ledgers. They were still careful with each other, maintaining a certain formality despite sharing a bed. Kyle kept his promise not to press for physical intimacy, though Beatrice increasingly found herself wondering what it might be like to be truly his wife in all senses of the word. She noticed things about him she hadn't before: the grace of his hands as they worked, the rare smile that transformed his solemn face, the gentleness he showed to injured animals. Spring blossomed into early summer. The garden flourished under Beatrice's care, with neat rows of vegetables pushing through the rich soil. The house, once neglected and gloomy, now gleamed with polish and purpose. Kyle often brought her wildflowers he found while riding the range, and Beatrice placed them in vases throughout the house, a small concession to beauty amid practicality. Their physical relationship progressed slowly, tentatively. A touch of hands at the breakfast table. Kyle's arm around her waist as they watched a sunset from the porch. Eventually, a goodnight kiss that lingered longer than propriety might dictate. Each small intimacy built upon the last, a careful exploration of boundaries neither had expected to cross when they began their arrangement. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Kyle broke their companionable silence. "I got a letter from my sister today." Beatrice looked up from her mending. "Is your father well?" "Better than expected. Doctor says he might even manage with crutches soon." Kyle hesitated. "Ellen wants to bring him for a visit to meet you." "I would like that very much," Beatrice said honestly. "When would they come?" "Next month, if that suits." Kyle studied her face. "Father can be difficult. His accident left him bitter. Most people who have suffered losses are," Beatrice observed. "My mother was the same during her illness." Kyle nodded, seeming relieved by her understanding. "I'll write Ellen tomorrow." They fell silent again, the rhythmic sound of crickets filling the air. After a while, Kyle spoke again, his voice unusually hesitant. "Beatrice, are you happy here?" The question caught her by surprise. Happiness was not something Beatrice had ever prioritized or even expected. Security, purpose, respect, these were the measures by which she evaluated her life. Yet as she considered Kyle's question, she realized with some astonishment that she was indeed happy. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." Kyle's hand found hers, warm and strong. "Good, because he faltered, then tried again. "Having you here has made everything better. Not just the house or the meals, but everything." It wasn't a declaration of love, not quite, but it stirred something in Beatrice's heart nonetheless. She turned her hand to clasp his. "For me as well, Kyle." That night, when they retired to their bedroom, something had shifted between them. As Kyle extinguished the lamp, Beatrice found the courage to move closer, resting her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, drawing her nearer still. "Beatrice," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "I want, but only if you're ready." In answer, she lifted her face to his. The kiss that followed was unlike their chaste wedding day exchange, deeper, questioning, a conversation without words. Beatrice felt something unfurl within her, a warmth she had never experienced spreading through her body as Kyle's hands tentatively explored. "Are you certain?" He whispered against her hair. "Yes," Beatrice replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm your wife, Kyle, in name and law. I would be your wife in truth as well." Their coming together was awkward at first, both inexperienced in their own ways. But Kyle's gentleness and Beatrice's determination carried them through. And by the time the moon had risen high above the ranch, they had discovered a new language between them, one of touch and breath and whispered encouragements. Afterward, lying in Kyle's arms, Beatrice felt a curious peace settle over her. This was not the marriage she had envisioned when she boarded that train in Boston, but somehow it had become something far more meaningful than the practical arrangement she had sought. "What are you thinking?" Kyle asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. Beatrice considered deflecting with a practical response but chose honesty instead. "I'm thinking that I never expected to find this kind of connection when I answered your advertisement." Kyle's chest rumbled with a quiet laugh. "Nor did I, especially after Alina." "What exactly happened with her?" Beatrice asked, emboldened by their new intimacy. Kyle sighed. "She wanted romance, excitement. I thought I could give her a good life, but she wanted more than just security." His arms tightened around Beatrice. "She said I was cold, that I didn't know how to love." "You're not cold," Beatrice said firmly. "You simply don't waste emotions, just as you don't waste words." "Is that how you see me?" "Yes, we're alike in that way, I think. We both keep our feelings close." Beatrice hesitated, then added softly, "Perhaps too close sometimes." Kyle was quiet for so long that Beatrice wondered if she had offended him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Beatrice Kincaid. And that terrifies me more than any stampede or blizzard ever could." The admission, so vulnerable and unexpected, brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. "Why does it frighten you?" "Because love means the possibility of loss, and I've lost enough already." His hand found hers in the darkness. "But I'm willing to risk it, for you." Beatrice turned in his arms to face him, though she could barely make out his features in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "I believe I'm falling in love with you too, Kyle, and yes, it's frightening, but perhaps that's how we know it matters." He kissed her then, a kiss that felt like a promise, a beginning rather than an ending. Beatrice surrendered to it completely, allowing herself to hope for something she had long ago dismissed as impractical, a marriage built not just on mutual benefit but on genuine affection and respect. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Beatrice's life. She and Kyle settled into a rhythm that suited them both, working separately during the day but coming together in the evenings to share their experiences. Kyle began teaching Beatrice to ride, laughing in surprised delight when she proved a natural horsewoman despite her city upbringing. "My father believed all proper young ladies should ride," she explained as they cantered across a meadow together. "He said it built character." "Smart man," Kyle called over the drumming of hooves. "What else did he teach you?" "Accounting, basic business principles, how to negotiate a contract." Beatrice smiled at Kyle's raised eyebrows. He had no sons, you see, and wanted someone to continue his business. Before he lost everything, of course. Kyle reined his horse beside hers. "Would you like to help with the ranch accounts? I've never been particularly skilled with numbers." The offer touched Beatrice deeply. It wasn't just a task being delegated, but a genuine partnership being offered. "I would like that very much." July brought sweltering heat and the anticipated visit from Kyle's father and sister. Beatrice prepared for days, airing out the best guest room, baking Mr. Kincaid's favorite foods, according to Kyle, and ensuring every corner of the house was immaculate. "You don't need to impress them," Kyle said, watching her polish silver that hadn't seen use in years. "They'll love you regardless." Beatrice gave him a skeptical look. "Your father lost his wife, his health, and his independence in quick succession. He had to leave the home he built. I doubt he's predisposed to love anyone at present, least of all the stranger who has taken his wife's place." Kyle conceded the point with a nod. "He can be difficult, but Ellen will run interference if needed." When the wagon finally appeared on the horizon, Beatrice stood beside Kyle on the porch, nervously smoothing her best dress. The woman who descended first was unmistakably Kyle's sister, tall and sturdy like her brother, with the same striking blue eyes and direct gaze. "Kyle," she called, hurrying forward to embrace him. "Lord, it's good to see you. You're looking well." "As are you, Ellen." Kyle returned her hug, then turned to Beatrice. "This is my wife, Beatrice." Ellen's shrewd eyes assessed Beatrice for a moment before her face broke into a genuine smile. "Welcome to the family, sister. I can already see you've worked miracles with this place." Before Beatrice could respond, Ellen turned back to the wagon where an older man sat scowling. "Pa, stop being stubborn and let Kyle help you down." Harold Kincaid was a diminished version of his son, once powerful, but now shrunken by age and injury, his left leg encased in a brace. His face, deeply lined and weathered, registered nothing but displeasure as Kyle lifted him carefully from the wagon. "Don't need to be carried like a child," he muttered, though he leaned heavily on the crutches Kyle provided. "It's good to see you, Pa," Kyle said, his voice gentle in a way Beatrice had rarely heard. "How was the journey?" "Hellish," the older man grumbled. "Roads are worse than I remember." His eyes found Beatrice, narrowing slightly. "So this is your mail-order bride, looking mighty prim and proper for ranch life." "Beatrice has adapted admirably," Kyle said firmly. "She's transformed the place." Harold grunted noncommittally, stumping past Beatrice into the house without a proper greeting. Ellen shot her an apologetic look. "Ignore him," she whispered. "He's been like this since the accident. It's nothing personal." Dinner that evening was a tense affair. Harold found fault with everything: the placement of furniture, the new curtains Beatrice had sewn, even the arrangement of plates on the table. "Margaret always put the salt cellar on the left," he snapped when Beatrice passed it to him. "I apologize, Mr. Kincaid," Beatrice said calmly. "I'll remember that for future meals." Kyle's jaw tightened, but Ellen smoothly changed the subject, asking about the cattle and the spring calving. Beatrice served the meal in silence, observing the family dynamics with careful attention. Despite his gruffness, Harold clearly adored his daughter, his expression softening whenever she spoke. His relationship with Kyle seemed more complicated, a mix of pride and disappointment, expectation and judgment. After Harold retired for the night, complaining of fatigue, Ellen helped Beatrice clear the table while Kyle checked on the livestock. "I must apologize for Pa," Ellen said as they washed dishes together. "He wasn't always like this. Mother's death broke something in him, and the accident just made it worse." "There's no need to apologize," Beatrice replied. "Grief affects us all differently." Ellen studied her thoughtfully. "You're good for Kyle, you know. I was worried when he wrote about sending for another bride after the Aliner disaster, but you're different than I expected." "In what way?" "Kyle described you as serious, practical. I expected someone cold." Ellen smiled. "But there's a warmth in you, Beatrice. It's quieter than most, but it's there. I see it when you look at my brother." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "Kyle is not what I expected either. He's never been one to show his feelings easily. Our mother was the only one who could really read him." Ellen handed Beatrice a dried plate. "But I can tell he's happy, happier than I've seen him in years." The conversation left Beatrice with much to consider as she prepared for bed that night. When Kyle joined her, she shared Ellen's observations. "Your sister thinks I'm good for you," she said as they lay together in the darkness. Kyle's arm tightened around her waist. "Ellen's always been perceptive." "Your father seems less convinced," Kyle sighed. "Pa's fighting his own battles. Give him time. He misses your mother very much." "Yes," Kyle was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I think he blames me for not being able to save her. The fever took her so quickly. I was in town when it happened. By the time I returned, she was gone." Beatrice turned to face him, her hand finding his cheek in the darkness. "That wasn't your fault, Kyle. In my head, I know that. But here," he placed her hand over his heart. "Sometimes I wonder." The vulnerability in his voice moved Beatrice deeply. "Your mother would be proud of you, Kyle, of the man you've become, the ranch you've built." Kyle's arms pulled her closer. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For understanding, for being here." The next morning, Beatrice rose early to prepare breakfast before the others awakened. To her surprise, she found Harold already seated at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the dawn-lit garden. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, startled. "I didn't expect anyone to be up yet." Harold turned, his weathered face unreadable. "Never could sleep past sunrise, habit of a lifetime." Beatrice nodded, moving to the stove to start coffee. They remained in awkward silence as she worked, Harold watching her every move with critical eyes. "You've changed things," he finally said. Moved the coffee pot to the left side of the stove. Margaret always kept it on the right. Beatrice stiffened, prepared for another criticism. "I can move it back if you prefer." "No," Harold said unexpectedly, "makes more sense on the left." Margaret was right-handed, you're left-handed. Surprised that he had noticed, Beatrice turned to face him. "Yes, I am," Harold nodded as if confirming something to himself. "You're not what I expected, so I've been told," Beatrice replied dryly. To her astonishment, Harold's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Kyle said you were serious, practical, said that's what he needed after that flibbertigibbet bit Aliner broke his heart. Aliner left him, yes. Fool woman couldn't see what was in front of her." Harold's gnarled hands gripped his crutch. "My son isn't demonstrative, but he feels things deep, like his mother." Beatrice considered the older man carefully. "You miss her very much." "Every day," Harold admitted, his voice rough. 42 years together and still not enough time." Something in his tone, the raw grief still evident after 2 years, touched Beatrice deeply. "Will you tell me about her? Kyle rarely speaks of her, but I know he loved her dearly." Harold studied Beatrice for a long moment, then nodded. As the coffee brewed, he began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing animation. He told her how he had met Margaret at a harvest dance in Nebraska, how she had chosen him over wealthier suitors, how they had traveled west together to build a life from nothing. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew," Harold said, accepting the coffee Beatrice placed before him. "Not just in body, though she could outwork most men, strong in spirit, never complained, never wavered, even when times were hard." "She sounds remarkable," Beatrice said softly. "She would have liked you," Harold said unexpectedly. "Seen herself in you, I think, that same steadiness." The words, coming from this difficult man who had shown her nothing but criticism since his arrival, affected Beatrice more than she could have anticipated. "Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. That means a great deal to me." Harold waved away her gratitude with an embarrassed gesture. "Just telling the truth, and it's Harold, girl, your family now." When Kyle entered the kitchen some time later, he found his father and wife engaged in quiet conversation. Harold gesturing as he explained the original layout of the garden while Beatrice listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that made the older man nod in approval. "Morning," Kyle said, unable to hide his surprise at the peaceful scene. Beatrice rose to pour him coffee. "Your father has been giving me valuable advice about the garden. Apparently the south corner gets too much shade for tomatoes," Harold grunted. "Been trying to tell Margaret that for years. Stubborn woman insisted that's where they belonged." Kyle exchanged a glance with Beatrice over his father's head, his eyes warm with gratitude and something deeper that made her heart quicken. The remainder of Harold and Ellen's visit passed more pleasantly than anyone could have expected. Harold still had moments of irascibility, particularly when his leg pained him, but he had clearly developed a grudging respect for Beatrice. Ellen, meanwhile, formed a genuine friendship with her new sister-in-law, the two women discovering shared interests in literature and gardening. On their final evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Harold cleared his throat. "Been thinking," he announced. "Might come back for a longer stay in the fall, if that suits." Kyle looked startled. "Of course, Pa, you're always welcome here." Harold nodded, his eyes finding Beatrice. "Like to see how those pumpkins turn out. If you follow my advice about the bone meal, should have a good crop." Beatrice understood the gesture for what it was: not just acceptance, but a desire to be part of their lives going forward. "We would enjoy having you," she said sincerely. "Both of you," she added, including Ellen in her smile. After Harold and Ellen departed the next day, Kyle found Beatrice in the garden, carefully weeding around the young vegetable plants. "You worked a miracle with my father," he said, crouching beside her. "Ellen says she hasn't seen him so engaged since before his accident." Beatrice sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "We found common ground. He knows a great deal about gardening." "It's more than that." Kyle's hand covered hers in the warm soil. "You listened to him, valued his opinion. That means everything to a man who feels useless." "He's far from useless," Beatrice said firmly. "His mind is still sharp and his experience is invaluable." Kyle nodded, his eyes soft as they studied her face. "You know, when I sent for a mail-order bride, I thought I was getting a housekeeper who could give me children, someone practical who wouldn't expect romance or sentiment. And instead you got me," Beatrice said, a question in her voice. "Instead I got you," Kyle agreed, his hand tightening on hers. "A woman who brings order to chaos, who stands her ground, who sees worth in difficult people. A woman who understands that real strength isn't about grand gestures but about showing up every day, doing what needs to be done without complaint." He leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. "A woman I've fallen completely in love with." The declaration, spoken in the middle of her garden with dirt on both their hands and the scent of tomato plants surrounding them, was more perfect than any romantic setting Beatrice could have imagined. Tears pricked at her eyes as she realized how far they had both come from their first awkward meeting. "I love you too, Kyle," she whispered, the words she had never expected to say feeling right and true on her lips. "More than I thought possible." His kiss tasted of sunshine and promise, of a future neither had dared hope for when they began their practical arrangement. When they finally broke apart, Kyle helped Beatrice to her feet, his arm sliding around her waist as they walked toward the house that had become their home. "Ethan mentioned the Hendersons are hosting another gathering next weekend," Kyle said casually. "Thought we might attend, as a proper couple this time." Beatrice smiled up at him. "I'd like that. Fair warning, there will be dancing." Kyle's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. "And I intend to dance every set with my wife. Even though she's too serious," Beatrice teased. Kyle stopped, turning her to face him fully. "You're exactly serious enough," he said, echoing his words from their wedding night. "Your strength is what I needed most, what I'll always need." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they now shared, Beatrice Kincaid stood in her husband's embrace and knew she had found something far greater than the security she had sought. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love built on the very qualities others had always criticized: her seriousness, her practicality, her quiet determination. Sometimes, she reflected as Kyle's lips found hers once more, the heart knows better than the head what we truly need. And sometimes, a practical arrangement can blossom into the greatest romance of all. 5 years later, Beatrice stood on the porch of Starlight Ranch, watching as Kyle taught their 3-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach where their second child grew. Beside her, Harold Kincaid sat in his chair, his bad leg extended before him, a contented smile on his weathered face as he watched his grandson's antics. "Boy rides like his father," Harold observed proudly. "Got a natural seat." "And his father's stubbornness," Beatrice added with fond exasperation as Thomas insisted on trying again after sliding sideways off the patient pony. "Kincaid trait," Harold chuckled. "Speaking of which, Ellen's letter came today. Says she'll be here next month for the baby's arrival." Beatrice nodded, grateful for her sister-in-law's support. Ellen had moved back to Whispering Pines 2 years earlier, opening a small school that had quickly become the pride of the community. Harold, too, had made the ranch his permanent home after his initial visit extended indefinitely. His expertise had proven invaluable as Kyle expanded their operation, and his relationship with his son had healed into one of mutual respect and affection. "Ma, look at me," Thomas called, his face alight with excitement as Kyle led the pony in a small circle. "I see you, darling. Well done," Beatrice called back, her heart full as she watched her family. The Starlight Ranch had flourished under their joint care. The cattle operation had expanded, the house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family. And Beatrice's garden now supplied vegetables not only for their table but for several neighbors as well. Kyle had even built a small greenhouse where she cultivated flowers year-round, a frivolity he had insisted upon despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. "You bring beauty to everything you touch," he had said simply. "The flowers are just an excuse to see you smile." As if summoned by her thoughts, Kyle looked up from his lesson with Thomas, his eyes finding hers across the yard. The love in his gaze, still as powerful as it had been on their wedding day, warmed Beatrice from within. "You two still look at each other like newlyweds," Harold grumbled, though his tone held more affection than criticism. "Enough to make an old man envious." Beatrice smiled, her hand finding Harold's weathered one. "You and Margaret had 42 years. Kyle and I are just getting started." Harold squeezed her fingers, his eyes misty. "She would have loved seeing this place now, seeing you and Kyle, the boy, the baby coming. This is what she always wanted for him." "I wish I could have known her," Beatrice said softly. "You would have understood each other," Harold assured her. "Both of you seeing beneath the surface of things. Both loving my son for exactly who he is." Later that evening, after Thomas was tucked into bed with a story and Harold had retired to his room, Beatrice stood at the kitchen window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. Kyle's arms encircled her from behind, his hands gentle on her pregnant belly. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured against her hair. Beatrice leaned back into his embrace. "I was thinking about the day I arrived, how terrified I was that I had made a terrible mistake." Kyle chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her back. "And I was thinking I'd been sent the most serious, formidable woman in creation instead of a proper wife." "We were both wrong," Beatrice observed, turning in his arms to face him. "Gloriously wrong," Kyle agreed, his hands framing her face. "I thank God every day for sending me exactly what I needed, not what I thought I wanted." As his lips found hers in a kiss still charged with the same electricity as their first, Beatrice silently echoed his gratitude. The serious Boston spinster and the solemn Montana rancher had found in each other not just a practical arrangement, but a love story worth telling, one built on strength, understanding, and the courage to see beyond the surface to the heart beneath.